So, as I mentioned at the top of the hour there, I am joined today by two members of the New Orleans Maternal Child Health Coalition, Dr. Claire Daniel and Ashley Hill Hamilton. I'm very excited to have them both here in the studio. So welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Dr. Claire Daniel is an administrative assistant professor at Tulane University's Newcomb Institute. Her teaching and research focus on reproductive politics in the United States and Louisiana. She also coordinates programming and experiential learning opportunities for students in the areas of reproductive rights, health, and justice. She's a member of the New Orleans Maternal and Child Health Coalition. So welcome.
Thank you.
Ashley Hill Hamilton is a native of New Orleans, a mother and a certified lactation counselor and holistic doula. Ashley is a founder of the Uptown Doula, a member, owner, and director of advocacy and outreach for Birthmark Doula Collective. She began her work in birth justice in 2012, teaching prenatal education and nutrition to pregnant high school students on a volunteer basis. Ashley has supported her clients through lactation support, childbirth education, and advocacy for reproductive justice-centered approach in medical care. Ashley believes in providing all birthing persons with the knowledge, options, and a voice to make empowered decisions for themselves and their families. So welcome to you also. So I wanted to start off a little bit with some definitions. So Ashley, what is a holistic doula, and what support do you provide your clients calling the Uptown Doula?
Yes. So a birth doula in general is a person from varying backgrounds. So that means we have doulas that are counselors, we have doulas that are stay-at-home parents, we have doulas that were servers in restaurants. Like, it doesn't matter what your background is, but coming into it and to provide continuous support during the pregnancy and labor and postpartum process, really to provide education. And when we say holistic doula, it just basically means that we are looking at the entire person and we're looking at the person in a holistic way. So we actually don't believe, contrary to popular belief, that we only support certain type of births or certain types of people. There are a lot of misconceptions about the type of client that we have or the type of birth that we support, and we believe in supporting birthing people holistically, no matter what your decision is. It's never my role to tell a person what to do with their body, but rather to support them with the decisions and empower them with the choices that they have made.
So could you let our listeners know a few specifics of sort of the services that you would provide as a doula?
Absolutely. So as a doula, we provide in-home services. We do prenatal and postpartum education. We also provide continuous support during your birth. So for example, like once you go into the labor process, into active labor, you give us a call and we actually join you, whether you're having a home birth or at the hospital, and we join you and we're with you there, providing different comfort measures, holding your hands, kind of like reviewing the things that we've gone through with the childbirth education classes. Some of them are in groups, some of them are private, depending on what our clients prefer. We get to know, outside of what a normal provider would get to know, we don't provide medical care, but we get to know our clients very intimately. So we're sitting at their kitchen tables talking to their grandmothers with them, and we're learning about the births of their parents and about different things like that. So we've really come with this very introspective view of learning, not just about what they want for this birth, but who they are as a person, who they are if they have a partner, what some of the challenges are. We talk about things anywhere from anatomy and physiology of the birthing process to how to keep in-laws at bay.
Well, and so just sitting here thinking about that, I imagine you have some wonderful conversations. I've probably gotten a really good sense of the history of maternal health and doula opportunities or services for folks across time in the city.
Absolutely. And something else that we heavily discuss with our clients, and one of the things we're very interested in, is what their fears are. And sometimes we ask them about, one of the questions that we actually ask sometimes through questionnaire is, can you tell us something that you don't want to discuss at that meeting? And it may be something that they don't feel comfortable. And we learn so much from asking that question about what you don't want to discuss. We learn about loss. We learn about maybe problems with conception, things that have gone on intimately, maybe in their relationships, and they may not feel comfortable if other family members are there, but it also gives us a really introspective view of who that person is and what they're bringing into this birthing experience.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Well, we'll talk a little bit more about doula work a little bit later in this interview, but I wanted to also then turn to Claire and ask, can you define maternal morbidity and maternal mortality for our listeners?
Sure. I'm going to use my little cheat sheet here. So a severe maternal morbidity is an unintentional labor and delivery complication that significantly impacts the short and or long-term health of the birthing person. A mortality is a death, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand when they hear about the statistics is that for every mortality, there are 100 severe maternal morbidities, mm-hmm. and those are very serious. So sometimes people think, well, people don't die that often in childbirth. Mm-hmm. Well, they die more often in childbirth in Louisiana than they do in other places in the country, and they die more often in this country than they do in other developed nations in the world, first of all. But also, for every one of those deaths, there's 100 severe maternal morbidities as well.
Yeah, the statistics are pretty staggering. I want to pull them up a little bit here. For instance, Louisiana maternal mortality rate ranks 50th among states, and the CDC estimates there are many as 100 cases of severe maternal complications for every one maternal death in Louisiana. Mm-hmm. But many of these are also preventable.
That's right. So the Maternal Mortality Review Board did a review of all the maternal deaths that took place between 2011 and 2016 and found that 45% of those deaths were preventable. And then another study actually just recently came out. It was profiled in U.S. News and World Report very recently that showed that the racial breakdown of those preventable deaths is inequitable, right? So 59% of the maternal deaths to Black women were preventable, whereas 9% of the white maternal deaths were preventable.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask that for you to talk a little bit about the racial disparities that exist in maternal health. Why is that?
So some of the racial disparities that exist in maternal health, one of the things that we're hearing, and you'll see it on T-shirts, Nurse Nikki has a T-shirt, and their T-shirts kind of like all across the country, and it says, listen to Black women. So when people are saying listen to Black women, what we're saying is that Black women are actually reporting having experiences or reporting pain and not being believed in the medical field. And what's happening is they're suffering from things like postpartum hemorrhage. They're going home experiencing things that maybe they have communicated prior to even leaving the hospital, and they're being told that it's normal or, that this is okay, or they're being sent home and then having severe complications afterwards that even lead to some morbidities. So when we talk about listen to Black women, that's kind of what that initiative is about, is saying that, one, we know that studies have shown that Black women are typically prescribed medication at a less rapid rate than their white counterparts. So knowing that people are not, and it's because of racial bias. So what's happening with racial bias is that you're looking in and making assumptions about who people are and making assumptions that they're going to abuse medication or that they're reporting this. And it's also reported that through many studies that Black women are perceived as having a higher pain tolerance than other people. So when a person is reporting something that feels, and I can speak from even experience of a person that I've supported where I literally had someone who was in the hospital that said that she felt like hot lava was coming from her brain and was given Tylenol for that. So thinking about how that person had to kind of like go back to the hospital and went home because they were experiencing severe complications. So that's just an example of one person. There are many stories of people who have died while waiting to seek care because of not being believed because of their race.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of racial bias and racial prejudice, racism
yes,
within this field, and throughout medicine, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and there's also a misconception that it's people who are not educated or people who are not seeking medical care, and that there are these different social determinants of health that are responsible for people not seeking care or not being compliant with care. And we've seen from examples like Beyonce and Serena Williams where that's not true. These are people who have access to the best physicians, but they're still Black women entering the healthcare system.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So thus the reason for the coalition. The New Orleans Maternal Child Health Coalition is an advocacy group made up of diverse stakeholders in maternal and child health in New Orleans. Members include researchers, healthcare providers, doulas, individuals employed by local and state government offices, and representatives of community organizations such as Bloom Maternal Health Clinic, Women with a Vision, Birthmark Doula Collective, New Orleans Breastfeeding Center, iWest, System Midwife Productions, and many others. And as we mentioned already, that the statistics are dismal in the state of Louisiana. I noticed in some of the material you provided that the coalition's work is guided by 7 values, including fostering and demanding racial equity and recognizing the importance of intersectionality in preserving the health and dignity of pregnant populations. Can you talk a little bit more about these values and how they guide both individual and coalition work? For instance, how are these values reflected in your work as a doula, Ashley? I think you kind of touched upon this already, but in the context of these racial inequities and racial disparities, how is this addressed in your work as a doula?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we do, I'm a Black woman, so the way that I actually came to my work as a doula is to, as from my own birthing experience. So everything that I do is informed by my own experience and as a means to like repair. And there's a quote that says, if you have come here to help me, don't. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And that's the approach that I take with this work. I'm not doing this work necessarily because, it just like feels good or like it's cool or it's catchy right now. I'm doing it so that my future birth experiences and the birth experience of my daughter and future generations can be repaired and they don't have to worry about the same things that a lot of people are going through right now. So with Birthmark, something that we specifically have done is we have a one-to-one program where we're able to provide doula services for people who would not otherwise be able to afford them. We have a one-to-one program, so for every paying person, we also have a person that we serve for free. And now we've been fortunate enough to get through some grant money and some donations from our really amazing supporters. We've been able to support paying doulas equitably for their work and being able to expand who we're able to provide doula services to. And the way that directly impacts maternal mortality and maternal morbidities is we're really like educating people and really empowering people. And I hate to use the word empower because we're not like sprinkling it on people like salt. But what we're really doing is we're not giving anyone anything that they don't already have inside of them, but we're letting them know that, hey, it's okay. If you have a question, ask that question. There is no question that's a stupid question. We want you to feel comfortable with challenging something if you don't understand what's going on or if you disagree with something. We're really using your voice and advocating for yourself. So as doulas, we're there to remind people of that fire that they already have inside of them. And also when giving birth, you're in such a vulnerable place where you're not thinking about exactly what's going on. And a lot of times people are able to be coerced into doing things that they may not be comfortable with, just because they're in such a vulnerable state. So we're there to kind of like act as a protector of space and energy in that capacity as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah. I was going to ask you also about Birthmark Doula's work around equity labs.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that program?
Absolutely. So we have like some really amazing things that have rolled out surrounding our advocacy work. I think for a very long time, Birthmark has done advocacy work and it's just been individuals within the collective. We used to have a core of 10 and now we've grown a little bit past there. But where people were involved in like equity work and advocacy work just kind of like on their own and doing different things. Really great work. We created the Black Birth Matters Conference, which happens every other year. Things like that to really bring awareness. last October, we actually were selected as a community partner with the Institute of Healthcare Improvement to do some quality assurance work within within a local hospital. And what that work looks like is in October, there was an equity lab where we invited people from reproductive justice, birth justice organizations, medical organizations, providers, et cetera, community organizations through across the city to come into one space and to have conversations about propelling equity through a birth justice lens. So what we really looked at was 3 components. We looked at prenatal care during the birth, and then also postpartum, and what that looks like, and what really needed to happen for Black women to have dignified care and allow them to be at the forefront of leading their care, not behind their providers, but alongside them, which is what we really promote. So as doulas, we don't come in and we don't lead the show, but we also empower people. We want to work as a circle of and have this circle of trust with the birthing person and also their provider as well. So we just want to be there to enhance that relationship. So what's come from the equity labs is pretty cool. There are these ongoing groups that exist, and we have persons of lived experience. When I say a person of lived experience, that's a person that's not really bringing representation from another organization. They're just bringing their own experience to it. Many people who exist in the other community organizations also are people of lived experience. I consider myself to be a person of lived experience as well, but I'm also coming from the capacity of like doula working from another organization. So we wear many hats, but we're kind of asking you to come in and just really get in there and lead what change in the hospital systems will look like. So something really cool has come from all 3 of them are working on very different initiatives. But one thing that's happened so far in one of the local hospitals is we talked about decreasing the separation time. And this was an idea that came from one of our persons of lived experience who's leading one of the groups, is to decrease the separation time between pregnant persons and their support person during triage, because that process can take sometimes over an hour where they're separated, just depending on what the flow is. And we were able to, just by asking one of our nurse volunteers who's on one of the committees, by asking only sensitive questions first and then allowing that person to come in and bring their support person back if they wish to have them join them, they were able to cut it down to like 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Which was amazing. So that's just a test of change, and we're building on that. We're doing some work surrounding getting some trust building visits for people to have with their providers, and just some really amazing work from partnering with folks from the hospital, community organizations, and people of lived experience. Is really beautiful.
I'm sure there are many people within the larger New Orleans community that just don't imagine or envision a bad pregnancy or pregnancy outcome. Like, they are getting the best care that they can afford, and they're going to the best hospitals, and it's maybe beyond their own experience or comprehension that a pregnancy and a birthing experience wouldn't be other than this sort of, what we think as a sort of glorified experience, right? And so to be able to create those environments so that everyone actually can have a positive birth experience, I think is really important, regardless of your race, your class, your gender, whatever all those sort of markers are. So, Claire, I wanted to ask you the sort of similar question is, like, how is this value of recognizing intersectionality and preserving the health and dignity of pregnant populations showing up in the coalition's work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's similar in a lot of ways to what Ashley was talking about, in the sense that the coalition, what we strive toward is for us to be made up of people from various sectors who can bring different perspectives, their own expertise to this issue, and kind of break down the silos between the different sectors that work on these issues. And that includes people of lived experience, right? And so I think we have a ways to go as a coalition to involve more people who are there, as not necessarily a representative of an organization, but as someone who has given birth and or plans to give birth and really cares about this issue. But that's one of the ways in which we we're trying to kind of live that value. But I think the other one is in our advocacy work. And so one of the things that we did fairly recently in November was a presentation in front of City Council, where we, and when I say we, I don't actually mean me personally because I was not one of the presenters, but representatives from the coalition presented the data, some of which we just talked about, and then some recommendations in terms of what the city can do to have an impact on those numbers.
Mm-hmm. And so the recommendations were what?
So we had 3. One was postpartum visits, that we should have ideally universal postpartum home visits for every birthing person. And one of the reasons for that, and I'm sure, Ashley, you can speak more to this, but is, and you actually talked about it a little bit earlier, but is the fact that some of these complications, or a lot of them actually, arise in the postpartum period. And to have someone come into your home and check in and see how things are going, for that to be an automatic part of the process might really help to prevent some of those complications from becoming more serious.
Well, and in fact, the American College of, I always stumble over these words. ACOG, as we know, ACOG recommends that people who have given birth receive 12 weeks of ongoing postpartum support tailored to meet their specific needs. Mm-hmm. How often does that actually happen?
There's normally, in the hospital systems, people normally have like a 6 to 8 week visit. So sometimes they're not seeing a person again until like 6 to 8 weeks postpartum. So we really want to use more of a midwifery model of care. And what the midwifery model of care looks like is where a person is normally seen 24 hours after their birth, and then they're seen within their first 7 days. And then for the first several weeks after birth, they're getting like a visit like once a week or making contact. So that's where there's really this push for postpartum home visits through Nurse Nikki does postpartum home visits. There are a few other organizations who are doing it. Birthmark now has a nurse advocate who is supporting us in doing home visits as well, where our doulas are able to see people postpartum. And while we don't provide medical care to folks, we're able to have conversations with them and talk to them, and, as my grandmother used to say, lay eyes on them and see like how this person is doing, identify if there are challenges with breastfeeding, encourage them to contact or reach out to their provider sooner if they're feeling something that maybe they were just going to brush off, if they're having, something that is not normal. And I think we really have to get out of like this language of like normal, because if it's not normal for you, it's not normal. Mm-hmm. And if it's something that you are concerned about and you are not feeling like yourself and it's a concern, then it's worth reaching out to your provider, whether that's your midwife, your OB, etc. Mm-hmm. So I think by having that, and with our nurse home visitor doing like blood pressure checks, because some things surrounding hypertension can be some of the driving factors of some of the mortalities that are going on. So having someone to do blood pressure checks and actually like look at that person within the first week, even like after they've gone home, and having a number where they can like text and say like, here, this is what I'm going on, and a person that's available. So definitely we need more people access and funds for postpartum home visiting, and that will save lives.
Mm-hmm. Another recommendation that you made to the city council was doula reimbursement.
Yes.
And how did you propose, or did you get questions about how the city would pay for that?
Well, actually, what we were specifically asking them to do was to put their support behind efforts that are happening on the state level to try and figure out ethical ways of doing doula reimbursement. So there is this effort happening on the state level. And I should say there are also efforts happening at the city level that we're hoping in our advocacy efforts to support and to put our sort of weight behind, if we have any weight. I think we do.
Well, I think this is a topic that's been, it's been talked about, and now it's really, really getting talked about from a policy position, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. So perhaps I think that there is more discussion around legislation and policy mm-hmm. Remedies.
Yes, and the doula reimbursement topic is tricky because there are examples of people having done it in other places in ways that ultimately ended up pushing out certain doulas, oftentimes doulas of color and doulas working with marginalized populations. And you can speak more to this too, probably, Ashley, but one of the things we were trying to emphasize in our advocacy was that we want to avoid that. And the people working on that at the state level are aware of those issues. And so we want to just put our support behind them figuring out how to do it in an ethical, equitable way.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we're working on right now is I'm actually going around the state conducting some focus groups with doulas to see how they feel about the Medicaid reimbursements that are currently in place in other states and what their thoughts are surrounding normalization of training, surrounding payment, surrounding just equitable practices and what that would look like. So I've done a focus group so far in New Orleans and just this weekend and this past weekend in Lafayette. So going to a couple other cities, but so that we can really be able to make some solid recommendations based on the voices of the people who do this work. Because oftentimes there are policies that are created. And when we talk about birth justice, when we talk about reproductive justice is expansive. So reproductive justice is encompassing of education. It's encompassing of housing. It's encompassing of, inclusion across the gender spectrum, all of those different things. And when you think about a lot of the decisions that are made, even like within the school system, you think about oftentimes those decisions are made without the people who it affects the most. Mm-hmm. So really having these focus groups is to really get the voices of the people who will be affected most greatly by this work.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about particularly anti-choice legislation on this show and how the voices of people that are affected by those laws really go unheard and unconsidered for a variety of reasons. But that's another show or a continuation of conversation. Before we move on, I just want to point out that the third recommendation that you made to the New Orleans City Council was a diversity of health workers in general. That was also an area in which we need improvement.
That's right. Right. And so what we were recommending and advocating for was for there to be some sort of grant program or scholarship program or funding that could help break down some of the barriers that are prohibitive to people of color, Black LGBTQIA folks, getting the sort of access to the training that they need in order to do these jobs, because we know that people benefit from having providers and advocates who understand their experiences and who look like them and who are empathetic toward them, and that helps with issues that Ashley was talking about earlier regarding implicit bias. So that's another thing that we think is really important that we need help with. And
what was the reaction of the city council members to your proposals?
They were, they reacted well, I think. They were supportive. And I think we've had a couple of them follow up with us, and we've had meetings with the city health department, and I think there's a general desire for us, for the kind of the city and the coalition to work together, and for us to be a resource to them as they're coming up with ways to address this issue, and also vice versa. I think there are probably ways in which the city can direct resources that would be beneficial to some of our coalition members as well.
Yeah, I imagine that it's a lot of education that has to happen first before any city council member can really put forth some sort of recommendation or change of law, correct?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. And so so this was the second time that we presented to city council. The first time was October of 2018. So we did it then, and then we did it in November of 2019. And in 2018, our focus was a little bit more, it was broader because we weren't just talking about maternal mortality. We were talking about birth outcomes more broadly and infant mortality and preterm birth. But both times we've presented them with studies, and one of the first sort of part of actually how we ended up coming together as a coalition came out of somewhat, I mean, there were many things, but one of the catalysts was a report that came out from collaboration between the National Birth Equity Collaborative and the Mary Amelia Center at Tulane University. And this report was a report about racial disparities in birth outcomes in Louisiana. I believe it came out in 2017. And one of the things that it did was just really lay bare the racial inequities, and also really it discussed how those inequities are the result of structural racism and implicit bias, right? So how exactly sort of in that vein of what you were just describing, Ashley, in terms of reproductive justice, how things like our education system, our transportation system, how our economic stratification maps over racial inequities, and that in addition to the implicit bias, that those two things are interrelated as well, right? So that report kind of teased out some of that, and I think was a call to action for some of us who weren't already involved. I mean, many of our coalition members have been doing this work for a very long time, like Ashley, and then some of us are newcomers to it.
Well, and you mentioned the importance of advocacy in the coalition's work, so I'm wondering, with the 2020 Louisiana legislative session about to kick off, we have our governor was reelected and sworn in, and new representatives, and so I'm just curious as to if you'll be proposing or supporting specific legislation during this upcoming session.
That's a great question.
Too early to ask, perhaps?
Well, the other thing to say about the coalition is that we operate with zero funding, and just on sort of our own willpower, we get together. We try to get together once a month. And
it sounds really familiar.
Yeah. So we would love to have those specific recommendations. But one of the things that we've been trying to do recently is really kind of like provide a little bit more structure to the coalition itself. And so that's sort of where the core values came from, was this desire to say, okay, who are we? What are our values? And to give people who want to get involved a sort of a framework to understand what they're getting on board with because we have also had a very open door policy. So anybody who has been interested is a member, right? Anybody who has expressed interest and wants to be involved. And so the core values are also meant to sort of, provide people with enough information to make that decision about whether they want to be involved. So that's kind of the stage we're at as a coalition.
Yeah, the coalition, I mean, we should be frank that the coalition isn't that old. You've only been working maybe 2 years?
A little less than 2 years.
A little less, yeah.
A little less than 2 years. So it's an emerging coalition, and growing in strength and influence. I think that's fair to say. And I will ask you at the end of the show how people can get involved and if you have other upcoming opportunities for volunteers. But back to the issue of the values, I also wanted to lift up that one of the values is to work to preserve and protect reproductive justice and rights, including abortion access. Ashley, you already kind of gave us a definition of reproductive justice. And certainly our listeners to Pro Frequency are well versed in what reproductive rights is and the work that many organizations in the city and across the state have been doing to ensure abortion access. But I wanted to ask, how is the coalition, this particular coalition, supporting reproductive health and rights? And what are the conversations around abortion within the organizations that belong to the coalition, or even perhaps with your specific clients?
Yeah, so I think it's very important also to start off that and say that reproductive rights and reproductive justice are not the same thing. That reproductive rights also exist within reproductive justice, but that reproductive rights largely focuses on abortion access, whereas reproductive justice is specifically and intentionally focusing on persons of color. Black people specifically having access to raise their children in the way that they see fit, to have children or to not have children, and to raise them in environments that are safe and fit. So meaning that you have access to food, access to housing, access to education, access to healthcare, all of those things. So I think a lot of times the conversation between reproductive rights and reproductive justice, and people are like, yeah, it's like all the same. And it's actually a little bit different. But also something that I mentioned a little bit earlier on, through our work as doulas, and also this overlaps with the work in the coalition, we are not in the business of telling people what to do with their bodies, right? At all. So we are not, so we are completely and 100% in support of people having access to healthcare. And we do believe that access to abortions is access to healthcare. So that's something that we believe in, something that we have been very strong about in supporting. And while we are not that organization, we are not a reproductive rights organization, we do support wholeheartedly and believe in propelling the work of organizations in the city who are doing that work.
Yeah, and as our listeners know, there's the Supreme Court case, or Louisiana law that's before the Supreme Court, and we'll keep our listeners up to date on that. But also, we're starting a new legislative session, and there hasn't been a legislative session since I've been working in this state where there isn't an anti-choice bill introduced, and so I anticipate there'll be others. I think that that working across these lines is really important, and so that's why I was sort of curious as to what the position of the coalition was, and sort of what the conversations are perhaps among members, or as you're talking about pregnancy outcomes or a birth experience, because we know sometimes that people seek out abortion later in their pregnancies because of fetal anomalies or threats to their health.
And a full spectrum doula, which we are also full spectrum doulas, they also support people who have experienced abortion or who have gone through abortion, because also that person also needs support. And I think a lot of times what gets lost in these conversations, maybe intentionally, is that pro-choice is not anti-life. So it's a person's right to choose. So right to choose access to what they want and what they feel the best decision is for them, their bodies at that time. Mm-hmm. So I think we support, that's all encompassing, but we have also supported people who have reached out to us, who have had abortions and want support during that process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Emotional support during that process.
Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a good place for us to end. I apologize having to cut the interview with Dr. Claire Daniel and Ashley Hill Hamilton of the New Orleans Maternal Child Health Coalition short, but we are running out of time here at Pro Frequency today. Certainly you can, as I mentioned, you can go to the WHIV FM website, and under demand, just click on Pro Frequency and find the date. This interview was recorded in January 16, 2020, and so you can listen to the remainder of that interview at your leisure. So thank you again for tuning into Pro Frequency, produced by Creative Community League. Check us out on Facebook, where you can find out next week's guests or interviews that we'll be sharing with you. Certainly we'll be back on air here next Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. Again, I just want to lift up that